In November 2012, Comet was still open. 250 stores across Britain, 7,000 people going to work every morning, shelves stacked with televisions, washing machines, laptops, everything a household could need. Then in the space of 2 weeks, it was gone. Not a slow fade, not a gradual withdrawal from the high street. 2 weeks, and every single store was locked, every light switched off, every member of staff handed a letter telling them not to come back. 7,000 people out of work. 7 days before Christmas. For 6 decades, Comet had been the place British families went to buy the things that mattered. The first colored television, the first video recorder, the computer that sat in the corner of the living room and changed everything. Comet did not just sell appliances, it sold the moments those appliances made possible. And then one morning, a sign appeared in the window. Closing down sale. It never came down. How does a British institution, 60 years old, trusted by millions, collapse in a fortnight? The answer is not simply Amazon. It is not simply the internet. It is something more deliberate, more calculated, and far more troubling than most people realize. This is the story of Comet, and it deserves to be told properly. The story of Comet begins not in London, not in a gleaming boardroom, but in Hull. Hull in 1933 was a working city, a port city, a place where men came home from the docks with sore hands and empty pockets, where families counted every shilling, where the idea of owning something electrical, a radio, a lamp, anything with a wire, felt like a small miracle. It was into this world that Michael Hollingbury opened his first shop. He called it Comet Battery Stores. The name was practical, almost blunt, because the business was practical and blunt. No pretension, no luxury, batteries, torches, wireless sets, the basic electrical goods that ordinary people actually needed. Hollingbury was not chasing wealthy customers. He understood that the families living on Hull's terrace streets wanted the same things as everyone else. They simply needed someone willing to sell those things at a price they could afford. The shop was small, a narrow frontage on a busy street, shelves lined with components and components alone, the faint smell of rubber and solder hanging in the air. But from the first day, it was busy, because Hollingbury had understood something that many retailers of his era had not. That working-class Britain was not a market to be ignored. It was the market. It was most of the country. Through the war years, through rationing, through the long, gray stretch of post-war austerity, Comet survived. It survived because it stayed close to what it was, a shop that sold useful things to people who needed them. No flourishes, no unnecessary expense. Just reliability and fair prices and the quiet dignity of a business that respected its customers. Then the 1950s arrived, and Britain began to change. The post-war economic recovery brought with it something the country had not seen before, a working class with money to spend. Not a great deal of money, but enough. Enough to think about a television set, enough to consider a refrigerator or a washing machine or a record player that could fill a sitting room with sound on a Sunday afternoon. Consumer electronics, once the preserve of the comfortable middle class, were becoming something every family wanted, and increasingly, every family felt they had the right to want them. Hollingbury saw it coming. As the 1950s progressed, Comet began to evolve. Battery stores quietly disappeared from the name. The product range expanded. Televisions arrived on the shelves. The boxy black and white sets that families would gather around in the evenings, the blue light flickering in the front window visible from the street outside. A second shop opened, then a third. Each one carried the same ethos as the first, straightforward, unpretentious, genuinely affordable. Hollingbury was not building an empire in the conventional sense. He was building something he believed in, a place where a steel worker, a bus driver, a nurse coming off a long shift could walk in and walk out with something that would make their home a little better, a little warmer, a little more alive. It was, in its own modest way, a radical idea. The Britain of 1933 had told working people that certain things were not for them. Comet spent the next 3 decades quietly proving that wrong. One television, one radio, one household at a time. By the early 1960s, Comet had outgrown Hull. The question was no longer whether the business could survive. The question was how far it could go. And that question, as it turned out, was about to get a very large answer. Ask anyone in Britain who grew up in the 1970s or 1980s where their family bought the television, and the answer comes back with barely a pause. Comet. Not because there were no other options, but because Comet had become, almost without anyone noticing, the default answer to a very specific and very important question: where does an ordinary British family go when it needs something that matters? The 1970s were Comet's first great decade. Britain was changing rapidly, and consumer electronics were changing with it. Color television properly arrived, in living rooms across the country. And with it came a hunger for the new that Comet was perfectly positioned to satisfy. The sets were expensive by the standards of the time. A decent color television in 1975 could cost the equivalent of several weeks' wages. But Comet had an answer for that too. Higher purchase. Two words that meant more to working Britain than any advertising slogan. You did not need the money today. You needed enough for the deposit, a signature on a form, and the quiet confidence that you could meet the weekly payments. Comet made it possible for a family in Leeds, or Coventry, or Glasgow to bring home a color television without waiting years to save for it. The set arrived, the family gathered, and something shifted. A small but permanent upgrade to the texture of daily life. This was what Comet sold in the end. Not appliances, moments. The moment the football came on in color for the first time and the pitch was actually green. The moment a mother switched on a new washing machine and heard it running quietly in the kitchen while she sat down for the first time in years. The moment a teenager lifted a needle onto a record on a turntable bought from the Comet on the high street, and the music filled the room. Walk into a Comet store in 1978, and the experience was unlike anything else on the British high street. The lighting was bright, fluorescent white, almost startling after the softer glow of most shops. The floor was hard and practical. And everywhere, on every wall, on every shelf and plinth and display stand, there were televisions. Dozens of them, all switched on, all showing the same channel, the same image repeated across 30 screens simultaneously. A slightly dizzying, quietly magnificent sight that no child who experienced it ever entirely forgot. The staff wore Navy uniforms. They knew the products. In an era before the internet made everyone an instant expert, the man in the Navy jacket at Comet was genuinely useful. He could explain the difference between two amplifiers, recommend the right aerial for a terraced house, tell you honestly whether the extended warranty was worth having. Customers trusted them, and that trust, built counter by counter across hundreds of stores, was the invisible foundation on which everything else rested. By the mid-1980s, Comet had more than 200 stores across the United Kingdom. From Aberdeen to Plymouth, from Belfast to Norwich, the orange and white signage had become as familiar a landmark as the red of a postbox. New product categories arrived with each passing year. Video recorders, microwave ovens, hi-fi systems with separate components that took up an entire wall unit. And later, as the decade turned, the first home computers, BBC Micros, Commodore 64s, the machines that a generation of children would crouch in front of for hours, learning without knowing they were learning. Comet sold all of it, and for millions of British families, Comet was the place where the future first became tangible. There are people alive today who can tell you, without hesitation, the exact Comet store where their father bought the family's first video recorder. They remember the car park. They remember the weight of the box. They remember the afternoon spent feeding cables through the back of the television cabinet while the instruction manual spread across the carpet. These are not trivial memories. They are the memories of a country modernizing itself, one living room at a time. And Comet was there for all of it. The Christmas season deserves its own mention, because at Christmas, Comet was transformed. The displays grew more elaborate. The television section blazed with seasonal programming. Families arrived, not always to buy immediately, but to look, to point, to make lists. Children pressed their noses against the glass cabinets where the latest games consoles sat under careful lighting. Parents stood in the hi-fi section comparing speakers with the intense seriousness of men discussing matters of great importance. The store hummed with a particular kind of energy, the energy of wanting, of planning, of the careful and hopeful arithmetic of family budgets stretched just a little further than usual. And then the higher purchase form came out again. And something went home that Christmas that would not have gone home otherwise. What was it about Comet, precisely, that made it feel like more than a shop? Perhaps it was the scale, the sheer volume of things on display, the sense of abundance in an era when abundance was not guaranteed. Perhaps it was the staff who treated working people as customers worth taking seriously. Perhaps it was simply the consistency, the knowledge that the Comet in your town looked and felt and operated exactly like the Comet 200 miles away, that the brand meant something reliable in a world that did not always deliver reliability. Whatever the reason, the loyalty ran deep. Generations of the same family shopping at the same stores. Grandparents who had bought their first television from Comet in 1971, bringing their grandchildren in to choose a games console in 1993. The thread of it running quietly through decades of British domestic life, stitching ordinary moments into something that felt, in retrospect, very much like the fabric of a shared national experience. By the mid-1990s, Comet stood at the absolute height of its powers, a trusted name, a national institution, a business that had grown from a single battery shop in Hull into one of the most recognizable retail brands in the country. But institutions, as history repeatedly reminds us, are never as permanent as they appear. And even as Comet's stores blazed with light and the tills rang steadily through 1,000 ordinary afternoons, something was already shifting, something so quiet, so gradual, that almost no one inside the company noticed it beginning. Growth for a retailer feels like success. More stores mean more customers. More customers mean more revenue. More revenue means more stores. The logic is circular and intoxicating, and in the 1980s, Comet followed it with the confidence of a company that had never seriously stumbled. The expansion had actually begun in earnest during the late 1960s and through the 1970s, when Comet made a decision that would define its physical identity for the next 3 decades. Rather than competing for expensive space on the traditional high street, Comet moved out of town, into the new retail parks that were beginning to appear on the edges of British cities. Large, flat, accessible by car, with car parks wide enough to load a washing machine into a Ford Cortina without difficulty. It was at the time a genuinely smart move. The out-of-town retail park suited Comet perfectly. Big box electrical goods needed big box retail space. Customers buying televisions and refrigerators were not browsing on foot. They were making planned purchases, driving specifically to the store, and they needed to park. The model worked. It worked so well that Comet became one of the defining anchors of the British retail park. The orange signage visible from the roundabout. The vast lit interior, a reliable landmark on the edge of every major town. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, new stores opened steadily. The Midlands, the Northwest, Scotland, Wales. Comet moved across the map of Britain with the quiet, methodical confidence of a company that knew exactly what it was and exactly who it was for. Then in 1984, everything changed ownership. Woolworths, at the time one of Britain's most powerful retail groups, acquired Comet. It was a significant moment, though it did not feel dramatic from the outside. The stores kept their name, the staff kept their jobs, the Navy uniforms stayed. But inside the business, something fundamental had shifted. Comet was no longer an independent company shaped by a single founding philosophy. It was now a subsidiary, one asset among several, subject to the priorities and pressures of a much larger corporate structure. For a while, the acquisition accelerated the expansion rather than slowing it. Woolworths had capital, and capital meant new stores. By the late 1980s, Comet's footprint had grown to well over 200 locations. The brand had genuine national coverage. There was barely a corner of the United Kingdom where Comet was more than a short drive away. The people who staffed these stores were, in the main, proud of where they worked. A job at Comet in 1987 was a proper job, not glamorous, but stable, with training, with a career path if you wanted one, with the particular satisfaction of work that had a clear and tangible purpose. You helped people. You explain things. You solve problems. A couple who came in bewildered by the difference between two washing machines left with the right one and the knowledge that they had been treated honestly. That mattered. It still matters to the people who did it. New store managers were arriving constantly, opening new locations, hiring new staff, learning the Comet way of doing things. For many of them, it was their first serious management role. A store in a new retail park in Swindon or Wolverhampton or Dundee was not merely a business unit. It was, for the person running it, a genuine professional achievement. These were not faceless corporate outposts. They were places that people cared about. But expansion at this pace carries its own dangers, and some of them are invisible until it is far too late. The original Comet, the Hollingberry business, the Hull business, the business that knew its customers personally and priced its goods accordingly, had been shaped by intimate knowledge of a specific community. As the chain grew, that intimacy became impossible to maintain. Decisions that had once been made by a man who understood his customers were now made by committees and offices far from any shop floor. The culture that had built the brand, practical, honest, close to the ground, became harder to transmit across 200 locations and thousands of members of staff. Quality consistency was not always what it should have been. Some stores were excellent, well-managed, well-staffed, genuinely attentive. Others were not. The customer experience, which had once been Comet's most reliable asset, began to vary in ways that the brand could not entirely control. And then, in 1993, Woolworths restructured. Comet was transferred into a new entity, Kingfisher plc, alongside B&Q, Superdrug, and a portfolio of other retail brands. For Comet, this meant a second change of ownership in less than a decade. Another boardroom, another set of priorities, another layer of corporate distance between the people making decisions and the people serving customers in Navy uniforms on a Tuesday afternoon in Telford. Comet was still growing. It was still profitable. To anyone looking at it from the outside, from the car park, from the high street, from the comfortable vantage point of a satisfied customer loading a new microwave into the boot, it looked entirely solid. But the foundations were no longer quite what they had been. The company that had grown from one man's belief in the value of honest, affordable retail had become something more complicated, something more corporate, something that served shareholders as much as it served the families who walked through the doors. And in the years ahead, that distinction would come to matter enormously. There is a particular kind of shop that becomes part of a country's furniture, not because it is the most exciting place to spend an afternoon, but because it is always there, always reliable, always exactly what it promises to be. By the mid-1990s, Comet had become that shop. It had taken decades to earn the position. But by 1995, the brand stood at the summit of British electrical retailing, more than 250 stores, a name recognized by virtually every household in the country. A reputation built not on glamour or aspiration, but on something more durable. The quiet confidence of a retailer that had consistently delivered what ordinary people needed, at prices ordinary people could manage. The mid-1990s were, in many ways, the perfect moment for Comet to be what it was. Britain was prospering. The long recession of the early part of the decade had lifted. Unemployment was falling. Families who had spent years being careful were beginning cautiously to spend again. And the technology arriving in the shops at this precise moment was genuinely transformative. Not in the vague, overused sense of the word, but in the literal, daily this changes how we live sense. DVD players arrived. The picture quality compared to VHS was startling. Families who had watched the same blurred tape of a favorite film 100 times suddenly had access to something that looked almost like cinema. Digital cameras began to appear. The ability to take a photograph and see it immediately, without waiting a week for the chemist to develop the film, felt like a small revolution in every household that experienced it. And then, as the decade turned, the internet arrived in the living room. The desktop computer, the dial-up modem, the extraordinary and slightly terrifying sense that the entire world had just become accessible from a desk in the spare bedroom. Comet sold all of it. And for millions of British families, Comet was the place where each of these moments became real. Not an abstract technological development covered in a newspaper supplement, a physical thing in a box that a member of staff in a Navy uniform helped you choose on a Saturday afternoon, that you carried to the car and unwrapped on the kitchen table and plugged in with slightly trembling hands. The generational transmission of this loyalty is worth understanding because it was one of Comet's most underappreciated strengths. The grandparents who had bought their first television from Comet in the early 1970s had children who brought their own families to Comet in the 1990s. The brand had threaded itself through 3 decades of domestic British life so thoroughly that choosing anywhere else, for many people, required a conscious decision. Comet was simply where you went. It had always been where you went. Your parents had gone there, their parents before them. The Christmas season at this peak was something to witness. The weeks between late November and Christmas Eve transformed every Comet store in the country. The television wall blazed with seasonal programming. Games consoles, first the Sega Mega Drive, then the PlayStation, then the Nintendo 64, occupied prime display space under careful lighting, surrounded by children who could have described the specifications in greater detail than most of the staff. The higher purchase desk was never quiet. The car park was never empty. There was a particular kind of controlled chaos to a Comet store at Christmas that felt, if you were inside it, like genuine national participation in something, like being part of the moment when the country decided, collectively, to treat itself. The staff at this peak knew they were part of something significant. Veterans who had been with the company for 10 or 15 years wore that tenure with quiet pride. New recruits arrived and were trained properly, given real product knowledge, sent onto the floor with enough understanding to be genuinely useful to the customers who needed them. There was in the best Comet stores of this era a culture of competence, a sense that the work mattered, that the customer in front of you deserved a straight answer, and that giving them one was a point of professional honor. Who in Britain over the age of 50 does not have at least one Comet memory? The television that went into the front room in 1996. The hi-fi system assembled on Boxing Day from a flat-pack box, with components that somehow needed to be connected in a sequence that the manual had failed to make entirely clear. The washing machine that arrived on a Tuesday morning on the back of a Comet delivery van, carried through the narrow hallway by 2 men who, against all physical logic, got it through the kitchen door. These are not the memories of a luxury brand. They are the memories of a brand that made itself indispensable, that lodged itself so deeply in the practical rhythms of British domestic life that its absence, when it eventually came, would leave a gap that felt disproportionate to what it had been. At the turn of the millennium, Comet appeared immovable, but appearances in retail are often the last thing to change. And behind the bright lights and the full shelves and the familiar orange signage, the world that had made Comet possible was already beginning to shift in ways that no one in the company's boardroom had yet found the courage to fully confront. The first shadows were falling. Most people inside Comet could not yet see them. Some could. In 1998, Amazon launched its British website. It sold books. Only books. The warehouse was modest, the selection limited, the delivery times measured in days rather than hours. Nobody at Comet's headquarters in Rickmansworth gave it serious consideration. Why would they? Comet sold televisions and washing machines and DVD players. Amazon sold paperbacks. The two businesses occupied entirely different worlds. That assumption would prove to be one of the most expensive mistakes in British retail history. But in 1998, it did not feel like a mistake. It felt like common sense. And so Comet continued as it always had, opening stores, moving stock, training staff, printing catalogs. The business was still profitable. The customers were still coming. There was no obvious reason for alarm. The first crack was not dramatic. It never is. It appeared quietly in the sales figures. Not a collapse. Nothing so clear and urgent as that. A softening. A slight and persistent gap between what the stores should have been taking and what they were actually taking. Footfall remained relatively healthy. People were still walking through the doors in reasonable numbers. But the conversion rate, the percentage of browsers who became buyers, was beginning almost imperceptibly to fall. The staff noticed before the spreadsheets did. Floor workers in Comet stores across the country began to observe a pattern that had not existed 5 years earlier. Customers would arrive with a level of product knowledge that felt slightly unusual. Not the vague general awareness of someone who had read a magazine, but the specific model number precise knowledge of someone who had spent an evening online comparing specifications. They would examine the product carefully. They would ask detailed questions. They would take out a mobile phone, still a relatively new behavior in a retail environment, and photograph the label on the back of the box. And then they would leave. Not all of them, not even most of them at first, but enough to notice. Enough for a store manager in Bristol or Sheffield or Edinburgh to mention it to a regional manager, who mentioned it to someone further up the chain, who filed it somewhere and moved on to the next meeting. The phenomenon even acquired a name: showrooming. Customers using the physical store as a research facility, benefiting from the expertise of trained staff, the ability to see and touch and compare products in person, and then purchasing online, where the same item costs 15 or 20 pounds less, sometimes more. The value that Comet provided, the knowledgeable staff, the well-lit showroom, the decades of accumulated retail expertise, was being extracted for free. The sale was going elsewhere. How do you charge for knowledge? How do you put a price on the 15 minutes a good Comet salesperson spent with a confused customer, explaining the difference between two similar washing machines in plain, honest English? You cannot invoice for it. You cannot fence it off. And in the early 2000s, Comet had no answer to the question, because the question had never needed answering before. Meanwhile, the ownership structure was shifting again. In 2003, Kingfisher demerged its electrical retail operations into a separate publicly listed company called Comet Electricals. Comet became the British arm of a European portfolio that included Darty in France and BCC in the Netherlands. On paper, this was a rational piece of corporate restructuring. In practice, it created a new and damaging set of priorities. KISA's management attention and investment capital were spread across multiple national businesses. The French operation, Darty, was consistently profitable and well-regarded. It absorbed a disproportionate share of boardroom focus. Comet, the British business, was often treated as the difficult middle child, not failing badly enough to demand urgent intervention, not thriving confidently enough to justify significant new investment. The consequences were visible to anyone who looked carefully. Store refurbishments slowed. Some Comet locations that had last been updated in the early 1990s were now showing their age. The fixtures worn, the signage slightly faded, the overall atmosphere carrying the particular staleness of a space that had not been properly maintained. The contrast with newer competitors, Currys, PC World, the electronics sections of the major supermarkets, was becoming harder to ignore. Staff investment followed the same downward trajectory. Training budgets were trimmed. The deep product knowledge that had been Comet's most genuine competitive advantage, the thing that justified a customer choosing Comet over the internet, the thing that made the experience worth having, began to erode. Not everywhere, and not all at once. But the trend was unmistakable to the people living it from the inside. A member of staff who had joined Comet in the late 1980s and stayed through the 1990s would tell you that something changed in the atmosphere of the company in the mid-2000s. A certain confidence drained away, a sense that the company believed in itself, that it knew why it existed and what it was for, was replaced by something harder to name. A kind of institutional hesitancy, a feeling that the people at the top were not entirely sure what Comet was supposed to be anymore. How long could a brand this trusted survive on reputation alone, while the substance behind that reputation was quietly being hollowed out? The customers, loyal as they were, would not wait indefinitely for an answer. And the people who should have been providing one, the executives drawing substantial salaries to navigate precisely this kind of challenge, were in the critical years between 2003 and 2010 looking in the wrong direction. The cracks were widening, and nobody with the power to repair them was reaching for the tools. There is a particular kind of corporate decision that looks on paper like strategy, that uses the language of restructuring, of efficiency, of unlocking value. But that is, in practice, something considerably simpler. It is the decision to take what can be taken as quickly as it can be taken and leave the consequences for someone else to manage. Comet's final years were shaped by exactly this kind of decision. To understand how a company with 250 stores and 7,000 employees could be dismantled in a fortnight, it is necessary to go back several years before the collapse, to the boardrooms and balance sheets where the real damage was done, long before a single customer noticed anything was wrong. The Casa years from 2003 to 2011 were years of managed decline dressed as stability. The investment that Comet needed, in stores, in staff, in the digital infrastructure that might have allowed it to compete on price with online retailers, did not arrive. What arrived instead was a series of cost reduction programs that trimmed the business in ways that felt manageable in isolation, but cumulative in effect. Maintenance budgets cut, training programs reduced, staff numbers on the shop floor quietly brought down so that the ratio of customers to available salespeople crept upward year by year, and in the quality of service that had once been Comet's defining strength became increasingly difficult to guarantee. Case's leadership was not blind to the challenges facing electrical retail in Britain: the rise of online competition, the showrooming problem, the margin pressure. These were discussed at board level. Reports were commissioned, consultants were hired, presentations were made in meeting rooms with views over the Hertfordshire countryside, but the response was consistently inadequate. The decisions made were the decisions of people protecting short-term shareholder returns rather than building a business capable of surviving the decade. Capital that could have funded a genuine transformation of the Comet offer, a serious e-commerce platform, a refurbished store estate, a reinvigorated service proposition, was instead used to sustain dividends and support the continental European operations that Case's management found more congenial. Comet's British customers were, in effect, subsidizing a strategy that was not designed with them in mind. The staff paid for it too, not in the dramatic, sudden way they would pay in November 2012, but in the slower, quieter way of people watching their workplace deteriorate and being given no satisfactory explanation. Experienced floor staff who raised concerns about falling standards were met with reassurances that had the quality of deflection. Store managers who flagged the growing gap between Comet's prices and the prices available online were told that the company was aware of the situation and was working on it. It was working on it for the better part of a decade. Nothing of substance changed. By 2011, Kisa had arrived at a conclusion that the more honest among its directors had probably reached some years earlier. The British business was not going to recover under its current ownership. The question was not how to fix Comet. The question was how to exit it. The answer they found was, even by the standards of the private equity era, remarkable. In February 2012, Comet Electrical sold Comet to a private equity firm called Op Capita. The sale price was $2, £2 sterling, the price of a newspaper and a bar of chocolate, for a company with 236 stores, 7,000 employees, and 6 decades of accumulated brand equity. The transaction was completed for less than the cost of a cup of coffee in any of the retail parks where Comet's stores stood. The reason the price was so low was not commercial modesty on Case's part. It was because, attached to the sale, Case provided Op Capita with a cash dowry of approximately $50 million, money intended, in the formal language of the transaction, to support the restructuring and recovery of the British business. In practice, it meant that Op Capita acquired Comet for nothing and received a substantial cash payment for doing so. The risk, theoretically, was that the recovery would fail and Op Capita would lose the $50 million. The people at Op Capita understood risk rather well. Henry Jackson, the firm's founder, had built a business model around distressed retail assets. Companies in difficulty purchased cheaply, restructured aggressively, and either returned to profit or wound down in a manner that extracted whatever value remained. There was nothing illegal about this. Private equity operates within the law, but the interests of a private equity firm acquiring a distressed retailer are not, by definition, aligned with the interests of that retailer's employees, pension holders, or long-standing customers. What followed the acquisition was not a recovery program. It was a managed extraction. The $50 million cash injection was absorbed into the business. Some of it funded ongoing operations. Some of it, according to subsequent investigations, was directed in ways that benefited Op Capita's position more directly. The Pension Protection Fund, the government-backed safety net for workers whose company pension schemes fail, would later find itself covering a deficit of approximately $46 million in Comet's pension fund. Thousands of long-serving employees who had contributed to that pension throughout their working lives at Comet received less than they had been promised. Some received considerably less. The executives who had made the decisions that produced this outcome received something different. Op Capita's management fees, extracted from the business during the 13 months of its ownership, represented a return on the firm's investment even as the company was failing. The precise figures remain a matter of some dispute, but what is not in dispute is the basic structure of the transaction, a structure in which the people with the least power bore the greatest risk, and the people with the most power arranged matters to ensure that their exposure was carefully limited. Inside the stores through the spring and summer of 2012, the staff were told nothing that would have alarmed them. The company was being restructured. There were challenges, but challenges were being addressed. The management was committed to the business. These assurances were delivered with the practiced confidence of people who had been in enough difficult corporate situations to know exactly what to say and exactly when to stop saying it. A warehouse supervisor who had worked for Comet for 19 years described later the particular quality of the silence in the months before the collapse. The sense that questions were being answered without anything actually being communicated. That the language being used by senior management had become somehow frictionless, smooth in a way that left no purchase for genuine inquiry. He did not know in the summer of 2012 that the company was finished, but he knew that something was wrong. He had known for a long time, and who, precisely, was supposed to protect the people who had given decades of their working lives to this company. The supervisors, the floor staff, the warehouse workers, the store managers who had opened new locations and trained new recruits and believed, with entirely reasonable grounds, that the business they served had a future? The answer when November 2012 arrived was nobody. Nobody was coming. The decisions had already been made, in rooms these people had never entered, by people whose names they did not know. The collapse, when it came, would be swift and total, and entirely without warning for the thousands of ordinary working people who had not been party to any of the arrangements that made it inevitable. They were about to find out. On the 2nd of November 2012, Deloitte was appointed administrator of Comet Group Limited. The announcement came on a Friday. By Monday morning, every one of Comet's 236 stores across the United Kingdom was open for business. But the business had fundamentally changed. The orange signage still stood. The car parks were still accessible. The televisions were still on the walls. The washing machines still in their rows. The laptops still open on their display stands. From the outside, a Comet store on the 3rd of November 2012 looked exactly like a Comet store had always looked. Inside, it was something else entirely. The staff arrived for their shifts that Monday morning, knowing what the weekend's news had confirmed, that the company they worked for was in administration, that their jobs were uncertain, and that the business they had served, in some cases for 10 or 15 or 20 years, was in the process of being wound down. There had been no all-staff meeting. There had been no personal communication from senior leadership. Many employees learned about the administration the same way their customers did, from the BBC News website or from a text message sent by a friend who had seen it on television. The administrator's immediate priority was not rescue. It was realization, the conversion of Comet's remaining assets, primarily its stock, into cash. This meant one thing for the stores, a closing down sale. Every location simultaneously began the process of selling off its inventory at discounted prices, with the proceeds going to Comet's creditors, rather than to any future version of the business. The signs went up in the windows within days. Closing down sale, everything must go. And something changed in the atmosphere of every Comet store in the country, something that the staff felt acutely and that certain customers, the ones who had shopped there for years, also felt, though they might have struggled to articulate it precisely. The store was the same. The products were the same. The prices were, if anything, more attractive than they had been a fortnight earlier. But the quality of the experience had been replaced by something that felt unmistakably like an ending. Customers came. Of course they came. A closing down sale at a major electrical retailer draws people with the reliable magnetism of any deeply discounted inventory. They filled the car parks, they queued at the tills, they loaded tumble dryers and flat-screen televisions into the boots of their cars with the focused efficiency of people who had identified a bargain and were not going to be distracted from it. But there were other customers too, the ones who came not primarily for the discounts, but because they had shopped at Comet for 30 years and could not quite accept that this was how it ended. They walked the aisles a little more slowly. They paused in front of displays they had no intention of buying from. Some of them spoke to the staff, not to ask about products, but to say something, to acknowledge what was happening, to register in some human way that this mattered. The staff, for their part, were extraordinary. In circumstances that would have justified bitterness, most of them chose professionalism. They continued to advise customers honestly. They continued to answer questions about products they would no longer be selling within weeks. They continued, day after day, to show up and do their jobs properly. Because that was what they had always done, and because the customers in front of them had done nothing to deserve anything less. The quiet dignity of Comet's staff during the collapse was not reported widely. It deserved to be. Behind the scenes, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The administrator's team was managing the wind down with clinical efficiency, but the human dimensions of the process were not always visible in the decisions being made. Redundancy notices were being prepared. The timeline for store closures was being finalized. The question was not whether Comet would survive. That question had been answered, but how quickly the remaining assets could be converted and the process concluded. The answer, as it turned out, was very quickly indeed. Through November, stores began to close in waves. Not all at once. The administrator needed the sales to continue as long as there was stock worth selling and customers willing to buy it. But the closures accelerated through the month, each announcement removing another cluster of locations from the map. The Comet in Wolverhampton, the Comet in York, the Comet in Swansea, the Comet in Inverness. Names that had been reliable fixtures of their local retail landscapes for decades, disappearing from the trading estate directories and the local newspapers' business pages, with a speed that felt almost indecent. The coverage in the national press was substantial, but surprisingly brief. There were reports on the job losses, articles about the pension fund deficit, opinion pieces about the state of the high street. The Guardian ran the headline that captured the human dimension most directly. Comet staff face bleak Christmas. And it did in a single line what pages of financial analysis could not. It placed 7,000 real people at the center of a story that the business press had been telling primarily in the language of balance sheets and creditor hierarchies. 7,000 people facing Christmas without work. Without, in many cases, the pension contributions they had been making for years. Without, in the most fundamental sense, the future they had reasonably believed they were building. The redundancy payments, when they came, were statutory minimum. The pension fund deficit, approximately $46 million, passed to the Pension Protection Fund, meaning that thousands of long-serving employees received reduced pension entitlements rather than what they had been promised. The law had been followed. The obligations had been met, technically. But the gap between what the law required and what basic decency might have suggested was wide enough to drive a removal lorry through. Op Capita, for its part, maintained that it had made genuine efforts to save the business, that the retail environment had proved more challenging than projected, and that the outcome was the result of structural market forces beyond any single owner's control. These statements were not without a degree of truth. The market was difficult. Online competition was real and intensifying. But the 13 months of Op Capita's ownership had not been characterized by the kind of transformational investment that a genuine rescue attempt would have required. The cash that had accompanied the two acquisitions had not produced a recovered business. It had produced an administration. No regulatory action followed. No individuals were held personally accountable. The mechanisms of British corporate law had been observed throughout. Comet's collapse was legal in every particular. This fact, more than almost any other detail in the story, seemed to trouble the people most affected by it. The last stores closed on the 18th of December, 2012, 7 days before Christmas. The final day at each location followed roughly the same pattern. The last items of stock were sold or removed, the tills were cleared, the displays were dismantled. Staff who had worked together for years said their goodbyes in stock rooms and car parks, exchanging phone numbers, making promises to stay in touch that some kept and others did not. The keys were handed to the administrator's representatives. The lights were switched off, and the Comet signs came down. In some locations, the building sat empty for months. The large purpose-built units on the edges of retail parks, designed specifically for a business like Comet, sized for big-box electrical goods, configured for the particular flow of customers buying large appliances, were not easy to repurpose quickly. Driving past some of these sites in the months after the closure, you would see the ghost of the signage still visible on the fascia, the faint outline of letters that had been there for 20 or 30 years, not quite erased by whatever had replaced them. In other locations, the transition was faster. Currys in PC World, owned by the same parent company, Dixon's Retail, moved into several former Comet sites with a speed that suggested the groundwork had been laid sometime before the administration was formally announced. The orange signage was replaced. The car parks were repainted. New uniforms appeared on new staff. The same building, a different name above the door. For the customers who had spent decades walking through those doors under the Comet sign, there was something almost surreal about the continuity of the physical space and the completeness of the institutional erasure. The store was still there, but Comet, the name, the history, the particular identity that had been built over 6 decades, was gone as thoroughly as if it had never existed. Somewhere in Britain, on the 18th of December 2012, the last Comet employee locked the last Comet door, walked to their car, and drove home. Nobody photographed it. Nobody filmed it. There was no ceremony, no acknowledgement, no moment of public recognition that something significant had just ended. There rarely is when the thing that ends is a shop. But it was significant, and the people who had worked there knew it, and a great many of the people who had shopped there for 30 or 40 years, for the television and the washing machine and the Christmas present that had made a child's face light up on a December morning. They knew it too. Something had gone. Something that, once gone, was not coming back. When the last Comet store closed, the questions that remained were not the kind that administrators answer in their final reports. The reports dealt with creditor hierarchies and asset realizations, and the distribution of whatever remained after the cost of the wind-down had been met. They were thorough in their way and entirely silent on the things that actually mattered to the people most affected. How does a family that had shopped at the same store for 30 years replace not just the shop, but the particular confidence that came with it? The knowledge that someone there would give them an honest answer? How does a man of 53 who has spent 19 years working for one company explain that gap on his CV to the next employer? These questions did not appear in any administrator's report. The physical spaces moved on with varying degrees of speed. Dixon's Retail, the parent company of Currys in PC World, Comet's longest-standing direct competitor, acquired a significant number of former Comet sites and trading assets. The transition, in many locations, was completed within months. Curry stores opened in buildings that had been Comet stores, carrying stock that overlapped substantially with what Comet had sold, serving customers who had previously been Comet customers. The retail function continued, the brand did not. Dixon's, to its credit, also hired a portion of Comet's former staff. Not all of them, and not always in equivalent roles, but enough to represent a genuine absorption of some of the human capital that the collapse had displaced. For those individuals, it was a lifeline, not a replacement for what had been lost, but a practical continuity that allowed them to remain in an industry they knew and had built careers within. For others, the outcome was considerably harder. Older workers, those in their late 40s and 50s, with long tenures at Comet and skill sets specific to a retail environment that was itself contracting, found the job market significantly less welcoming. The electrical retail sector was shrinking, not growing. The broader high street was under sustained pressure. The transferable skills were real, but the opportunities were not always there. Some found work in other retail roles at reduced seniority and reduced pay. Some left retail entirely. Some did not find stable employment again for a very long time. The pension situation remained a source of genuine grievance for years after the closure. The Pension Protection Fund absorbed Comet's pension liabilities and provided a degree of protection that would not otherwise have existed. But the fund operates on a compensation model that does not make pension holders whole. It covers a percentage of the promised entitlement, with caps that affect longer-serving and higher-earning members disproportionately. Workers who had contributed to their Comet pension for 15 or 20 years, and who had made retirement plans on the basis of what they had been promised, found themselves recalculating those plans on the basis of considerably less. Op Capita faced scrutiny from journalists, from parliamentary committees, and from the Insolvency Service. The Insolvency Service investigation, which examined the conduct of Comet's directors in the period leading up to the administration, concluded in 2014 without resulting in disqualification proceedings against any individual. The transactions had been legal. The conduct, while aggressively self-interested, had not crossed the threshold that British law requires for director disqualification. The law had been followed. The people who had lost the most were left to absorb the consequences of arrangements they had never been party to and could not have influenced. The broader retail industry drew lessons from Comet's collapse, or said it did. The showrooming problem became a central preoccupation of electrical retailers throughout the 2010s. Currys and PC World invested in a service-led proposition, the Know-How brand, designed to provide the kind of expert assistance that justified a customer paying a modest premium over online prices. The logic was the same logic that had made Comet valuable in its best years. The argument that knowledge and service and the ability to see and touch and compare products in person was worth something. That argument was not wrong, but it required consistent investment and genuine commitment to make it work. And Comet's final owners had demonstrated conclusively what happened when that investment was withheld. The malls and retail parks that had depended on Comet as an anchor tenant experienced the familiar ripple effect of a major closure. Smaller retailers in the same developments reported falls in footfall. Some did not survive. The physical geography of British retail, already under pressure from online competition and changing consumer habits, shifted a little further in the direction it had already been traveling. What does it mean when a gathering place disappears? When the store where 3 generations of a family made their purchases of record players and video recorders and laptops and games consoles simply ceases to exist, and nothing that replaces it carries any of the accumulated history or the particular quality of trusted familiarity, it means that something is lost that cannot be recovered by a better website or a faster delivery service. It means that the texture of ordinary life becomes slightly thinner, slightly more transactional, slightly less anchored in the kind of physical community that retail, at its best, had always helped to create. Comet did not save itself, but it is worth being precise about why it did not, and about who made the decisions that ensured it could not. Picture a Saturday afternoon in 1984, a retail park on the edge of a British town, the kind of town that had a working high street and a football club and a market on Thursdays. The car park is busy. Families are arriving, some with children who have been promised nothing specific but who understand, from the particular quality of the outing, that something interesting is about to happen. Inside the Comet store, the light is bright and even and slightly different from the light outside. Cooler, more deliberate, the light of a space that takes its contents seriously. Along the far wall, 30 television sets are playing simultaneously, a football match on some of them, a Saturday afternoon chat show on others. The combined effect is a wall of moving color and sound that no child who stood in front of it ever entirely forgot. A father is in the hi-fi section, speaking quietly to a member of staff in a Navy uniform. The conversation is serious, considered. 2 people genuinely trying to arrive at the right answer about amplifiers and speakers and what the room at home will and will not accommodate. The staff member knows what he is talking about. The father knows he is being told the truth. A mother is looking at washing machines, comparing the drum sizes, calculating in her head the arithmetic of the weekly payments against the convenience of a machine that actually fits the family's laundry. A child is standing in front of a display of blank VHS cassettes for reasons that are not entirely clear even to the child. This is not a remarkable afternoon, it is an entirely ordinary one. And that is precisely what made it extraordinary. The fact that this particular quality of ordinary afternoon was available, reliably and consistently in towns and cities across the entire country for the better part of 4 decades. Comet was never a glamorous brand. It did not sell dreams in the way that certain retailers have always sold dreams. The aspiration, the lifestyle, the carefully constructed image of who you might become if you owned the right things. Comet sold something considerably more honest than that. It sold access. For the families who used hire purchase to bring home a color television in 1976, Comet was the mechanism by which the gap between what they could afford today and what they needed was bridged with dignity. There was no shame in the transaction, no condescension in the way it was conducted. You came in, you chose what you needed, you signed the form, and you went home with the thing that was going to make your household's life a little better. The shop treated you as a customer worth serving properly, and you responded with a loyalty that lasted, in many cases, for the rest of your life. This is what the balance sheets could never capture. The loyalty of a family that had bought every major appliance from the same brand for 30 years. The trust of a customer who walked in not knowing what she needed and walked out knowing she had been given an honest answer. The quiet confidence of a generation of British workers who understood that if the television broke or the washing machine needed replacing, there was a place to go. A reliable, familiar, decent place, and it would sort them out. The staff were the invisible infrastructure of all of this. The men and women who learned the products, who gave up their Saturdays, who stayed late when the delivery was complicated, who explained for the 100th time the difference between two similar models with the same patients they had brought to the first. They were not celebrated. They were rarely even noticed, in the way that people who do their jobs well and reliably are rarely noticed, because their competence was indistinguishable from the general texture of an experience that simply worked. When Comet closed, they lost more than their jobs. They lost the context in which their particular skills and their particular knowledge and their particular relationship with a community of customers had meaning. That loss was real, and it was not recoverable. You cannot download 19 years of institutional knowledge. You cannot transfer to a new employer the specific trust that a specific customer had placed in a specific person over the course of decades. What Britain lost when Comet closed was not merely a retailer. It lost a particular quality of commercial relationship. The relationship between a trusted local institution and the community it had served long enough to understand. That kind of relationship takes decades to build. It can be destroyed in a fortnight. And it was. Somewhere tonight, someone is telling their children about the first television their family ever owned. About the Saturday afternoon, their father spent an hour in the hi-fi section talking to a man in a Navy uniform who actually knew what he was talking about. About the Christmas morning when the thing they had wanted all year was finally there, under the tree, in a box that had come home from Comet on the back seat of the car 3 weeks earlier, hidden in the loft ever since. About the washing machine that lasted for 20 years. About the video recorder that the whole family gathered around on a Friday night. About the particular quality of a December evening in a Comet car park, cold and bright, carrying something heavy toward the car, knowing that Christmas was actually going to happen this year. These memories are not trivial. They are the record of a country furnishing its homes and its lives over the course of 4 decades, doing so carefully within its means, with the help of a brand that understood what ordinary British families needed and made it its business to provide it. Comet is gone. The buildings remain, wearing different names above their doors. The car parks are still full on Saturdays. The televisions are still on the walls. But the particular thing that Comet was, the specific accumulation of trust in history and human knowledge that made it more than a place to buy appliances, that does not transfer with the lease. It went out with the lights on the 18th of December 2012, and the lights have not come back on since.